Mikel, hi. Congratulations on your appointment. Tell us what it means to you to be back at this club, how big a challenge it is for you.
I feel back home. I'm extremely happy and proud to have given the opportunity to be the manager of this football club. I've been preparing for a few years for this challenge to come. I know the expectations, I know the level, and I know the stature of this club and what it deserves. So I'm ready for that challenge. I can't wait to start working with the players and everybody here at the club. But I've got a good vibe. I'm sensing a good energy today since I walk in a London colony. So it's giving me even more energy and I feel so happy. I can't say any other thing.
That was Mikel Arteta's first answer as Arsenal manager on the day he was unveiled. Obviously, it's 5 years since that happened. He inherited a team that were 10th in the league with problems in the dressing room and behind the scenes. James, you've looked at his 5 years. What did he inherit at the Emirates and how far has he taken them so far?
I mean, it was a mess, really. The end of the Unai Emery era could probably have come a month or two earlier. The mood around London Colney was particularly toxic. I mean, I remember being told a story that they were flying back from a Europa League game and on the team plane they were making fun of Emery's accent, doing sort of mock Spanglish, impressions of him within earshot of the manager. It just got to the point where he completely lost control, really, of the dressing room. And you had characters there who were on big money, Mesut Ozil, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, Alexander Lacazette, big characters who needed a manager who could come in and really grab them by the scruff of the neck and sort of say, look, this is the way we want to play, this is what we want to do, and it's my way or the highway. And for the first part of it, it was my way for Arteta. They won the FA Cup within 9 months of him taking charge. And he did so really by instilling discipline both off the pitch but also on it. They were a very rigid team. They beat City and Chelsea in the semi-final and the final of that competition. They didn't have many shots on target. I think they had 2 shots on target against City. I think they had 4 shots in the whole game and beat Chelsea. So, they were efficient and it was all about just trying to instill that structure. And then I think what was quite significant as well is that after that FA Cup win, which of course was delayed because of COVID, so it took place in August, beginning of August that year, 2020. In September, a month later, he was promoted effectively to manager from head coach. And while that sort of sounds like a sort of semantic thing, almost admin, it was quite a significant moment because it meant that it was a sort of symbol of the growing autonomy and control that Arteta had at the club. And what they were trying to say to the dressing room was, this guy is in control, because there was still, even though they won the FA Cup, there were still issues behind the scenes. It's not as though those characters suddenly changed overnight. It's just that he, by winning that trophy, had established a degree of authority that the club wanted to back up with a sort of formal title, if you like.
Can I just put some context on this? Because obviously this wasn't like going in at Manchester United post Felix Ferguson, because obviously Arsenal under Arsene Wenger, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years of the last years of his reign, there was a malaise, wasn't there? And Unai Emery came in, inherited that malaise, didn't quite turn it around. So Mikel Arteta was having to do a different job to most clubs. He had to kind of change the mentality, change the sense that Arsenal were a big club. They are one of the biggest clubs in England, but at the time it felt like they were so happy to finish in, 4th place. The standards had dropped a lot, hadn't they?
Yeah, and a lot of it was to do really with the amount of change at above the managerial level at the back end of the Arsene Wenger era, and then through Unai Emery's time at the club, because as we sort of talked about on this podcast before, Wenger's autonomy was complete at Arsenal, and over the last sort of couple of years, prior to his departure, that was gradually stripped away. So they implemented a new structure where they had 9 departments and divided responsibility, with department heads heading up each area of sort of football expertise, to kind of have then a head coach to slot in within that, rather than a manager sitting above everyone else, being the one guy who makes all the decisions. And it didn't really work with Unai Emery. He's gone on to have a fantastic, spell at Aston Villa, but I think he's learnt a lot from his time at Arsenal. I think he's a better communicator now. He's a better tactician. He's a better manager. And really, Arteta came in and inherited that situation and accepted it to start with because it was his first managerial role. He didn't have the body of work behind him that he could say, well, no, you're going to make me a manager and I want the control of it. I think he feels he's earned that by, instilling that discipline firstly, winning that FA Cup, really kind of taking control of all levels of the club. And I think it's interesting that, people look at Arsenal and Manchester United as a comparison to sort of go from, one autonomous figure in Fergie or Wenger and, this is how you do it because Arsenal have shown a relative degree of success. It's not been a fluid, consistent sort of straight line. They put all these department heads in and then kind of during COVID, they announced 55 non-playing redundancies due to the financial impact of the coronavirus. And they've gradually kind of organically almost got themselves into a situation where Arteta and Edu, obviously is now no longer the sporting director, but it was Arteta, Edu, and then one or two board members, Per Mertesacker heading up the academy, and that's kind of it. They're sort of the decision makers again, and it all flows through Arteta. So if you kind of see where he was when he took over, head coach, trying to learn his way, to where he is now in 2024, where he is actively involved in the recruitment of the sporting director, who should be his boss, it kind of shows you just how he's taken the club and assumed that level of control.
It's interesting, that point, because you just mentioned Man United there, and I know we talk about United a lot on this podcast, but they're in a period now where they're going the opposite way. They made a massive point of giving Ruben Amorim the title of head coach, the first head coach in the club's history, and the idea was that you strip away the responsibilities of the figurehead of the club because they felt that the job was too big, and they felt that stripping away that the responsibilities would help whoever it was, the head coach, whoever, concentrate on coaching the team, picking the team and getting results on a Saturday. And then you've got Arsenal, who have gone down that route, but during the time of that Arteta's been there, have kind of emboldened him more and more with more and more power, and have almost kind of elevated him closer to a Ferguson or a Wenger figure.
But just before we get onto that point, I think it's important to stress at the outset of his reign, he made some massive decisions on the players. Mesut Ozil, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, and that kind of asserted his authority, showed that he's ready to make big decisions. And every manager has to assert their authority at some point, and he did that very quickly with those two.
And he had the support of the ownership through that, and this is where they deserve a lot of credit for that, I think, because we're talking about the comparison with the United, they've sort of taken 2 or 3 steps down the road with a manager, then they've got rid of him, they've gone back to zero, they've gone down a different path, a couple of steps, come back to the centre. To be fair to Arsenal and the Cronkies, they took a really difficult decision to start paying these players off. It got to, I think it was January 21, so December 2020, Aubameyang was stripped of the captaincy. And then a month later, they ripped up his contract and he went to Barcelona. And he there were several big moves that followed. Mesut Ozil was on 350 grand a week, and my sources told me at the time that he got 90% of the money that he was owed. 90% of the money he was owed.
That's important. The board, Arteta's had that benefit of having a very strong and stable team above him. Yeah. Whereas, you can talk about United again, that's not been the case. They were there right behind him, and every manager needs that, don't they? They need that support from above. And even at times when it was difficult for the owners to write off that money, massive financial hits.
Well, when I spoke to Josh Kroenke in the summer for a piece on the site, we had a conversation as he was going back to his car where I talked to him about that period, and I won't reveal exactly what he said, but I mean, he was discussing it in a way that he was, almost sort of wiping the sweat off his brow, even sort of 3 years on, to sort of say that was the toughest period for them, because it's difficult. You're talking to businessmen and you're saying, okay, so in Ozil's case, I think he got about £7 million. Well, what are you getting for that? Oh, it's about the culture. It's this intangible. You can't measure it on a balance sheet. So how you explain that to an owner is very, very difficult as a manager. But they accepted. But they accepted it, and they ended up paying in total 9 players off. This is huge amounts of money to literally just get characters out of the door because they feel they felt they were toxic.
Makes it successful now. That to take that hit at the time, it's paid off. The dividends are now being shown in the team that they've got and the manager they've got and the way the team is playing. And I think that is the issue, isn't it? That you have to make these tough decisions, and Arteta made them. The board backed him with those decisions, and that's why we are where we are now. I think, but just on the fact that Arteta is now obviously very strong in where he is. You referenced the Chelsea game, December 2020, where it could have gone either way. But the fact that there were no crowds in the stadium because of COVID, They were 15th, I think, in the Premier League at the time.
Yeah.
Having won the FA Cup, they were basically drifting along and flatlining, but he survived.
Well, because in the way that we described earlier, the sort of rigidity of the team as a positive in the way that they won the FA Cup, it began to become quite frustrating. You know, they were having 2 or 3 shots on target a game every game. And players were almost, you could see the patterns and you could see the shape of the team very clearly, but there was not they weren't playing with any freedom, and it all felt too static, and the fans were getting frustrated by it. And I think, you know, as much as Arteta at the time talked about how, you know, it's frustrating that the fans aren't in the stadium because we can't connect with them and we need that positivity, I think it helped him a lot that the fans weren't there, because, you know, there was a lot. Okay, you can't necessarily use social media as an accurate gauge, but there was a lot of negativity around, and even the fans who were getting in, remember those days when there were 2,000 are able to get in the stadiums, you know, it was lukewarm towards him, but they won that game on Boxing Day against Chelsea, and Emil Smith-Rowe and Bukayo Saka were really the shining lights, along with Gabriel Martinelli, all 3 players in their early 20s, I think they were 2021. And it really sort of, in the same way of getting the players, those sort of senior players who were troublemakers out of the club, you suddenly had this kind of core group of kids coming through who actually were good enough to be able to not only replace them but improve upon them.
Because he's had those low points, he's almost become the post boy for patience now, hasn't he, Arteta? That every single manager in the Premier League who's under pressure gets asked a question. You know, Arsenal have backed Arteta and stuck with him when there was a point at which it looked like he could have been sacked. I don't think there would be many qualms, would there, if he'd been sacked around that time?
No, and also, I mean, obviously there was the Amazon documentary the season after when they started that season with 3 defeats. They lost 5-0 at City at the end of August, no goals, and the atmosphere then was really nasty,
bleak,
you know. And you were thinking he's got maybe that next break after the international break, that next sort of month or so, and if things don't pick up, then he's really in trouble. But again, that summer they started to spend very well, and this is something we should talk about. Is their recruitment has been very, very good. They signed Martin Odegaard that summer for about 30 million. I mean, that is an absolute steal now. You know, you think about where he's come from, this sort of journeyman kid, really, wasn't he? A journey kid, that's not a word, but, you know, cut that out.
Leave it in.
But he kind of got to this point where people didn't really know if he'd ever make anything of this prodigious talent that he had as a teenager, and yet he's now become the club captain, one of their highest paid players, one of the best players in the Premier League, one of the best players in the world, you could argue, certainly in midfield. You know, and he signed that summer, and he needed a bit of time to bed in. They brought in Aaron Ramsdale. They brought in, you know, young Saliba kind of came. Although that was a signing from the Unai Emery era. Still, Saliba was brought back into the fold by Arteta and has become one of the best centre backs in the league.
Also made some pretty brave ones as well. I remember reading the reports of Ben White signing and thinking 50 million, that is far too much for Ben White. I've seen him play a couple of times. I thought he's a good player. He's not a £50 million Arsenal defender, and since he's arrived, he's proved everyone wrong, hasn't he? That's quite a brave decision to spend that much money on a player who wasn't at that level at the time.
Yeah, I mean, you know, they haven't got them all right. I mean, you know, Fabio Vieira is probably one that they're regretting now. They still kind of need another attacking player. I know we're going to come on to where they are now, but yeah, I mean, Ben White at the time looked like, you know, they'd overpaid.
Yeah.
I remember their first game, the debut at Brentford away, they lost, and Jamie Carragher actually murdered him afterwards in his post-match analysis, and you could see why. You know, he looked as though he didn't have the physicality or the mentality to be able to handle it at the top level, and yet he's become an absolute key defender, one of the best in the league. So yeah, I mean, you know, their recruitment went to another level the following summer, of course, when they went and bought Declan Rice for 105 million. Now you could say, well, that deal, you know, that's obvious. He's going to be, he was already one of the best players in the league. Go and get him, he'll make you better. But that isn't the sort of deal that Arsenal have ever done. They smashed their transfer record by
beat City to it as well,
30 odd million,
which was major at the time.
You know, and it was a summer where, you know, the evolution of the team was quite clear. You know, they signed Rice, they signed Kai Havertz, they signed Jurriën Timber. They were. I mean, all right, Havertz isn't sort of physically imposing, but he's tall. And it was another sort of step towards, we're going to make the team more robust. We're going to, you know, this whole. Nico Jova gets a lot of credit for the set pieces, but I mean the physicality in that team now, they are a team of, that's a big side now.
I mean, it's very different.
And that was a conscious decision in the transfer market.
It's very different from the old Arsenal. I mean, you've been covering Arsenal, what, 15, 20 years?
Yeah, 20
years. I mean, in that time, is this as positive as it's been? Because I suppose 20 years ago was just after they've won the the Invincibles, and they haven't won the league since then.
Yeah.
And it is a different team now. The Arsenal team back then was a really, really good team on the eye. It was attacking. It was fast. It was powerful. Different kind of Arsenal now, but the mood does seem to be the best it's been for a long time at Arsenal.
Yes, it is, and I think it's you got to remember that Arteta's sort of experienced that as a player. He lived through those years. He was there from 2011 to 2015, 16. I mean, he joined just after they got thrashed 8-2 by Man United at Old Trafford. And this was, you always think back to that day as being, okay, there were a number of other factors. They just played a Udinese away and the team had changed and they were tired and whatever. But still, the gulf between those two sides who would habitually, fought a duopoly at the top of the Premier League was just a reflection of how far they'd fallen.
And if you look back at that United team now, by the way, and I mean, Tom Cleverley, Danny Welbeck, but to lose to 8-2 to that United team was a real indictment, wasn't it?
Yeah, and Arteta lived that. He lived through the years of saying, all the familiar tropes. They've lacked leadership. They're soft. They can't do it in a cold Tuesday night at Stoke. All that style of stuff. He lived that. And so he's come back as a manager, and he understands the sort of inherent historic weaknesses that Arsenal have had, and he's made them a much stronger, much more powerful proposition. The issue he's potentially having is getting them over the line to actually win the big prizes, and that's obviously the final step for him.
Well, yeah, so he's been here 5 years. He's turned them into title challenges, again, legitimate title challenges, but has only won one major trophy, that FA Cup, very early in his reign. If you had to say definitively either way, has he been a success? I know you two have got different views on this. Yes or no?
Do you want to go first?
I will, because I will say yes on the basis of everything we've just talked about over the last 10 or 15 minutes. He has transformed that club, and he has done it on his own terms. Yes, obviously with the backing and help of the board and senior figures around him, but he has done that single-handedly. He has got them to the point where they are the main challengers to Man City before the last 6 weeks when City have disappeared off the face of the earth. But he's got them to a point where now the final step for them is to win the Premier League, is to win the Champions League, is to start competing, March, April, May, every year for the major honours. Now, I know Mark's about you. I can see you're pregnant with, criticism. Can't wait to jump in, but that is the final step, and he does have to take that. But I think if it all ended tomorrow, and for whatever reason he walked away or they sacked him, you'd look back on this 5 years and say it's undeniable progress, and whoever was to come in to replace him, if that hypothetical situation emerged, would be inheriting a fantastic opportunity to go and win silverware.
I agree with that. There has been progress. Absolutely. He's taken Arsenal to a place close to where they should be. But I think we're now at the point where 5 years in, if you compare him to say, Jurgen Klopp at Liverpool, Jurgen Klopp by, I think, year 3 had won the Champions League, maybe year 3.5 Champions League, then he won the Premier League the year later. And even now, Arne Slot's come in at Liverpool and already overtaken Arsenal. For me, you look at his cup record, it's pretty poor. His cup record since winning the FA Cup in 2020 hasn't been past the fourth round of the FA Cup. Now, we know they're in the semi-finals of the Carabao Cup, which is, Arsenal haven't won that for... Arsene Wenger never won that trophy. So, that is a step. Champions League, again, poor, considering what Arsenal are supposedly one of the biggest clubs, well, they are one of the biggest clubs in England. I just think we're getting to the point now where they really need to push through. Mikel Arteta talks a good game, but I think at times it doesn't deliver. And I think Arsenal, to me, look like a team that are kind of getting back to when they were under Wenger. They're happy to finish fourth. They're just happy to be in the conversation. They're a young team that seems to enjoy being where they are. I just don't see that ferocity and that experience and now you've got at Liverpool with people like Salah and Van Dijk. I think they do miss that kind of play that's been the course. Mikel Arteta's not been the course, and I think I just think that, and Thierry Henry made some really good points earlier this week on when he was covering doing some punditry work. The point that he said Martinelli's greatest asset is his pace, but he never uses it. He'll try and take a defender on by stopping, cutting back. So he said what happens now is opponents know that Martinelli won't go past his defender, so the ball will go to Saka. And all teams now know that Bukayo Saka is the main threat on the wing. Now, Mikel Arteta should have worked that out a long time ago. It's not just about being like Stoke and Bolton by being really good at corners and free kicks. No, seriously, because what
Have
teams
you
will
seen
work-
that picture of him looking like Tony? Someone's fused his
Yeah,
face with
yeah,
Tony
exactly,
Pulis.
yeah.
It is unbelievably
dressed in a club
good.
shop.
Yeah.
But, teams are smart, Premier League teams and coaches, and they've all got the set-piece coaches, most of them have, will work out how to stop Arsenal. So when Nico Jova's threat is minimised, what is the next step? Where do Arsenal go? I haven't seen enough evolution in the way that Arsenal play in the last 2 years to say that they can go that next step. They just look... I'm not saying they're soft, that's the wrong word, there's a softness, but I think they haven't got that killer instinct that they've got at Man City and at Liverpool, and maybe even at Chelsea.
I think that the regret, if they have one, will be that they didn't sign another forward player in the summer.
Absolutely.
And you're right about the sort of the predictability of the team, in the sense of, the pattern of the sort of Odegaard drifting over to the right hand side to Saka, with now Timber, or it would have been Ben White when he was playing, and that overload on the right. I mean, it's predictable. We know it's coming, but teams generally haven't been able to deal with it for quite a long time. But that is the way Arsenal attack. And I remember in last season, Thomas Tuchel in a quarter-final presser against Bayern Munich, he just outlined it. He just came out and just said, "This is how they attack. They attack down the right-hand side. This is what we'll try and do to stop them." And they did, and they knocked them out. And I think the issue they're having is because Martinelli has sort of stagnated a little bit, because Leandro Trossard hasn't maybe kicked on, or is kind of a good squad player, but he's not somebody who's going to necessarily improve your starting 11, because Fabio Vieira didn't really work out, because Nicolas Pepe didn't really work out, that they are maybe one winger short. And you could argue, of course, that maybe they need a better centre forward than Kai Havertz. But I think one other point I'd make is when you talked about the mentality, when Gabby Jesus and Alexander Zinchenko arrived from City, that was heralded sort of at Arsenal as a real change for them in terms of being able. There's two winners. They know how to do it. They were in the building, and Arsenal didn't have that. If you look at Arsenal now, they've really outgrown those two.
Yeah.
And Jesus, okay, he scored a hat-trick against Palace the other night, but he had one in 32, 33 games before that. Bit part player. Zinchenko can't really stay fit. When he does, he looks really, really vulnerable at left back. And they've got other players who can invert and play that role now anyway. So again, the team sort of tactically kind of evolved beyond them. It feels as though they need another summer like that, or even a January like that, where they go and get one, maybe two players who've been there, who've done it, who've got the pedigree, who can slot straight in. And that is, I think, all they're missing. I don't agree with you necessarily about the mentality. I just think tactically, and in terms of squad depth, they just need a little bit more.
It's almost like they need an Eric Cantona or Robin van Persie. That final piece of the jigsaw. Obviously, two strikers that made a massive difference at Man United. But I look at Arsenal, I think there's so many games where they should win, but they don't take the chances. I like Kai Havertz. I think he's got a lot of talent, but he's not a centre forward. And we know that Arteta looked at Ivan Toney and decided against it in the summer. Maybe he should have backed himself, because those two players, certainly Cantona and other players, Luis Suarez at Liverpool, managers that take a gamble on players with a difficult personality, they're often rewarded. There can be times when they're not rewarded, but I think Arteta at times is in danger of going down the Arsene Wenger route of being so stubborn in his principles and his philosophy that he needs to amend it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I know for a fact that they would rather, there is a sort of view internally that they would rather wait for the right player than gamble on the player that's available. And they've kept their powder dry purposely for that. A lot can change between now and January next summer, but Benjamin Sesko at Red Bull Leipzig was the one that they wanted, I think, and he signed a new contract. But they are still in contact with the agents, and I think there is a view that they might be able to get him out of there next summer. But again, you're talking about now waiting for 6-7 months to get what they believe is the right player, when there is an opportunity there to go and win the title this season.
And that's it, though, isn't it? If you're saying that Arteta's big success has been to change the culture of the dressing room and change the dynamic and the type of player you're bringing in, why would you want to risk that for one player who might possibly be that last piece of the jigsaw?
Because you might win the league.
But then you also might not, and you might set you back 2 years.
Well, that's the gamble, isn't it?
Well, I mean, he signed Raheem Sterling on loan from Chelsea, and that's not really worked out, but he knows Raheem Sterling. So again, he's kind of going what he knows, and control freak is probably the wrong phrase, but he is very much a guy who likes to be in control of everything. I think sometimes you have to let that go, and the players you've name-checked before, Van Persie, Cantona, Suarez, would Mikel Arteta have signed any of those players?
No, and there is... Look, I mean, obviously when he went in and he tried to establish himself, working with kids is the logical way to go, right? Because they don't know any better. They're there. They're willing to learn.
Away, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. I don't think there's any evidence yet to suggest that he can't necessarily handle those players. But he is getting to a point now where the squad is getting a little bit older. They are, they're better travelled, they're more experienced, they know what they want, and they can see that it's within sight. And whether there are tensions there in terms of how they get there remains to be seen. What I think is interesting actually more is off the field with the sporting director issue, because, that is a big change. They've lost their chief executive, Vinay Venkatesham, had been there for 13, 14 years. They've lost Edu, who was kind of his right-hand man. He wasn't his boss, who'd been there for 5 years. And how they replace that. Now, Richard Garlick has stepped up as a managing director. It's a slightly different role to chief exec, but it's effectively what he's doing. How they then replace Edu, who goes in, what responsibilities does he have, how does he work with Arteta, how does he work with the recruitment team, the analytics side, all of that stuff. That's a big appointment for them to get right. And, if you're Arsenal, do you look at it and do you say, okay, we want to get someone who will work effectively within quite an unconventional structure, which is not as Arteta's boss, so we keep Mikel happy? Or do we say, well, actually, no, the club is bigger than the manager, so we bring in the right guy for this position and Arteta's going to have to lump it? And then you create the possibility of tension that there hasn't been for the last 5 years between senior figures at the club about the future direction and transfers and everything
that's
else.
the sense you get, that tension's a good thing. Tension can be a good thing at clubs. Challenging personalities actually get better results. We saw it at Man City back in the early days when Roberto Mancini was a real pain to the people at the club, but he got them over the line. He won the league title, he won the FA Cup. He was difficult, but he pushed them to where they had to be. And if people at Arsenal don't want that kind of tension, it almost suggests that they're happy to just drifting where they are. And it strikes me that, this might wind Arsenal fans up a little bit, but Mauricio Pochettino had some great years at Tottenham. 5 years, got to Champions League final. A very similar story. Turned the club around, great young players, didn't go over the line. If you had to compare 5 years of Pochettino and 5 years of Arteta, who actually has the better outcome?
That's a ridiculous statement.
Why is it?
Because Arsenal have been gone from a mid-table side to genuine title challengers.
Well,
He also got over the line and won something.
Yeah, but he won an FA Cup in COVID. Pochettino got to Champions League. He got to a Champions League final. He got Tottenham. Tottenham chance for the title a couple of times. So
they didn't really, did
the
they?
Leicester year,
the Leicester year they were.
But
they didn't even finish second that season.
But Pochettino was heralded as this great transformative coach at Tottenham. So are you saying that Arteta's done much better than Pochettino at Spurs? Sorry, Rob might be.
Well, yeah, because he won something and they have turned into genuine title challengers.
So are Tottenham. They got to the Champions League final as well.
We'll also look at the points tallies. The
Yeah,
points tallies are just Arsenal have been way more consistent.
But they didn't win the league.
I'm not saying they did,
Didn't win
but
Champions
we're
League.
comparing them with Pochettino Spurs. And I like Pochettino. He did a fantastic job at
Yeah,
Tottenham.
the only difference is FA Cup winning in 2020. That is the only difference. He's got a trophy on the table, and that matters. It's a major trophy. But Arsenal haven't been to a Champions League final since 2005. 2006. What year was it? That long ago? I've forgotten.
It was 2006. No, 5. It was 6.
I just think in general terms, terms of general transformation from where he's picked them up to where they are now, that transformation is bigger. And Pochettino, if he was sat, he would probably say, well, I didn't have the funds and I didn't have the money that Arteta has spent, and that's probably fair enough. But in terms of where he picked them up to where he left them, the transformation of Arsenal under Arteta is far greater than Spurs under Pochettino.
But if Arteta's time at Arsenal ends with just one FA Cup,
Well, he wins because he still won something.
Yeah, no, but it's Arsenal, isn't it? It's one trophy in 5 years.
I also
Man
think
United have won more in the last 5 years.
But don't you think that? I mean, when did Poch leave Spurs? 2019. So in the last sort of 5 years, has the league not gone to another level in that time? Has City not just taken it to another level in terms of the consistency?
Yeah, but you can only compete against what is in front of you.
Yeah,
at the time.
but what I'm saying is that Arteta's done what he's done in a harder era than Pochettino has in terms of the Premier League, because City have just been that good for that long, and Liverpool obviously in their zenith the last sort of 3 or 4 years as well.
And that's the point that Guardiola makes quite a lot. That if you're judging managers, we're sat here now saying that Arteta needs to win more than an FA Cup, so domestic trophies don't count. Eric Ten Hag would probably tell you that. So if you're only judged on the Premier League and the Champions League, only 2 teams every year can win that. So does that mean that every team every year who doesn't win it is a failure.
No, you can't denigrate a trophy. An FA Cup or a League Cup is a sign of progress towards a bigger success. And Arsenal haven't made that kick on. They've gone close. You're right. I mean, they've gone, 2 runners-up spots in the Premier League, but they haven't won it. Tottenham didn't win anything either.
But you also that same old debate then. So if you're Arsenal now, does Mikel Arteta want to win the League Cup this year and finish 4th, or win nothing and run Liverpool close and finish within a point of Liverpool and finish 2nd?
I think you want to win a trophy, don't you?
I don't know.
Well, to some extent, he's the victim of his own success because the expectation level is raised enough that I think the mood around Arsenal is they expect to if they don't win the league, to go very, very close this year. Having been close the last 2 years, I mean, the biggest regret Arsenal will have at the end of this season is if Man City don't win the league, and it doesn't look like they will, that they aren't the ones to pick up the mantle, because they've been knocking on the door for 2 years. They were far and clear away. They were the second best team, toe to toe with them. And then, if we'd all sat here in August and I'd said to you, City will be whatever they are now, way off the pace in December, who's going to be top of the table? I think everybody would have said Arsenal, right? But the fact is they've been overtaken at the moment by Liverpool and by Chelsea. Yeah. And if they end the season like that, that will be a huge disappointment for Arteta.
The era that Arteta is working in, because during the 90s and early 2000s, if you finished above Man United, you won the league. You speak to players of that era, they only ever had one challenger. United had one challenger every single year. And now you're talking about Arsenal maybe dipping just slightly and being overtaken by 2 teams in Liverpool and Chelsea. That's how tough it is. And that's why it's really difficult to say that if Arteta never wins the Premier League with Arsenal, he's failed, because it's too tough a competition to win to be judged solely on that.
Yeah, but if I think Chelsea are a big threat, because Chelsea have come from nowhere, but they look really good, Chelsea. And, if Chelsea overtake them in London and Liverpool win the league, I just think that it will be a missed opportunity from Mikel Arteta's point of view and Arsenal's point of view. And it gets back to what you've said about sometimes they just need to have allow that bit of tension into the club, allow that bit of, a difficult character that take a gamble on the player that they might not want. They need to change the mentality a little bit, more mentality change, I guess, to take them over the line.
Just one final one on this one then. How much patience has Arteta got with first the Arsenal ownership and the board, and also with the fans? When does he have to win something major?
I think he's got more patience or credit in the bank with the owners than with the supporters, probably. Because of the journey that they've been on together and the support that they've shown him and the control and the influence that they've given him to this point. He's going to be a very, very hard man to replace. And of course, he's just signed a new contract as well, let's remember. So, he's sort of well set there till 2027, I think it is. Look, I mean, fans are a long way from turning on him. It's not, I don't think that they're anywhere close to that, but there is a sense of frustration, I think, that they are not doing everything within their power to be the team that replaces City at the top of the table. And that most obviously is in the squad deficiencies that we've talked about. Arsenal have not been a great watch this season, not at their fluid best most consistently. Obviously, we talked about the set-piece threat, the sort of Odegaard-Saka combination is great to watch, but it is really the only way that they tend to open teams up. So then the onus is on him to inject some more creativity, a bit more dynamism into the side. But we're only talking a few percentage points here. It's not as if we're talking about a radical overhaul. A big January signing, perhaps, although we all know how difficult that market is to operate in, and a real push for the league. And I mean, obviously, if they win the league, he's immortalised. If they don't, I think he gets next season. But I think they need a big summer, and if they don't start well next season, then you're into year 6 and you're thinking, well, I don't want to say has he taken the club as far as he can, but you do start to think, well, if if second is second the limit for them, do they need something different? And the squad is well set. Most of the key players are on long-term contracts. As I say, the ownership is set. You'd start to then think about the manager in those terms, but I think we're a long way from that.
I do have a little bit of sympathy in the sense of getting a striker in, because I was speaking to somebody a couple of weeks ago about this actual subject about getting strikers in either January or in the summer. And they said, well, look, he said, there's a real dearth of strikers. He said, who's France's main guy? Mbappe, you're not getting him. Who's England's main guy? Harry Kane, and obviously forget that for Arsenal straight away. Spain's main guy, I haven't really got one. You're looking at probably Victor Gyökeres or Samu Amrodion in both in Portugal with Porto and Sporting. And they're both gambles, because the Portuguese league is as good as Benfica and Porto can be at times in in Europe, they're not. It's not an established league like the Big Five. So if you take one of those players, you're taking a gamble. So there's not really an obvious fit. There's not, you talk about Sesko. He didn't have a great Euros, did he? He was quite poor with Slovenia. So it is difficult.
Bayern are keen as well.
Yeah.
I mean, if Arsenal go for him, they won't have a clean run at him either.
So it's a tough task to get that right player in. But still, there were players that they could have gone for this summer. So quickly, just to finish this off, Arteta said that he bleeds Arsenal. Do you ever see a point where he might manage another Premier League club?
Well, whenever this topic comes up, I'm always reminded of the day Jurgen Klopp announced he was leaving Liverpool, and Arteta had a presser either that day or the next day, and it struck me in Klopp's sort of departure. He sort of said, I could never manage another club in England. Liverpool are in my heart. I could never go up against them. All this sort of stuff. So I thought, this is quite let's throw this at Mikel, because obviously he's played for Everton. He's been a coach at City. And I thought, so I said to him, you're obviously very happy here. Do you ever see yourself 10, 20, 30 years, if you go that long into management, ever managing another club? And he just completely fudged the answer. He just sort of said, look, who knows what will happen? I'm here and I'm happy and I'm settled, and who knows what the future will bring, all this kind of stuff. In the sort of way that if a player had said that with 18 months to run in a mix zone, we'd all be writing, refuse to rule out, a move or all that kind of stuff. So look, it could be overanalyzing an answer, but you sort of think, as and when the time comes for Guardiola to move on, he is a logical candidate for them. He's the continuity candidate, isn't he, really?
Yeah.
Given what he's done. But then,
Do you want to follow Pep Guardiola at Man City?
Possibly not. And would, could Arsenal really countenance losing their manager to, I'd say their biggest rivals, but their biggest rivals of the last 2 years anyway?
On that, I had a conversation with City officials in Seville a couple of years ago when they were talking about what happens after Pep, and it was before he signed his last contract extension, the extension that he signed during the World Cup in Qatar, and they were talking about possible replacements. And the one thing the one name that came up was Nagelsmann, and he was at Bayern at the time. And someone turned around and said, "Well, you'd never get him. He's at Bayern. That's his dream job. You'd never get him out of Bayern." And this guy at City said, "Well, why not? City are now one of the most attractive propositions in world football to be a manager. You had offered pretty much unlimited funds, the chance to win all the trophies that you could possibly want. Why could City now not go to Bayern or Arsenal and say, we want to talk to your manager?" And in the past, that seems completely fanciful, because no one would ever do that. But City have got a genuine belief now that when the time comes to replace Pep Guardiola, they could go to anyone. And whether that's Arsenal or not, it remains to be seen. But they would certainly think that Mikel Arteta would be within their grasp.
Yeah, but not everyone would want to manage in League Two.
Man City got a very big...
reply to James in the comments.
They've got a very big few months ahead, Man City. And I always say that Arsenal are one of the biggest clubs in the country. And going to Man City would not necessarily be a step up. It could be a step sideways, because Arsenal's history, it's London, etc. So anyway, that's for a different day. It's time for a break. When we come back, we'll discuss the marginal gains that some clubs are employing in the Premier League.